What's up, YouTube? This is 82-0. Welcome back. So, I wanted to cover the history of the center position. I think this is something that doesn't get talked about enough. I was watching, I like to watch old games on YouTube, and I was watching the 1986 NBA Finals, Game 3. And in the halftime report, or whatever you want to call it, they were covering the history of big men in the game. They covered Miken. They interviewed him at halftime. They covered one part. They covered Wes Unseld and Willis Reed, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So it kind of got me wanting to do a video on the history of the center position and how it's evolved. Now, this may sound pretty hard to believe, but early basketball. I'm talking before the NBA. Okay, the NBA didn't emerge until 1950. It was a merger of two basketball leagues, the BAA and the NBL. This would become the NBA. But prior to this, prior to the NBL even, well, maybe not prior to the NBL, because at the end of the NBL, they had George Miken. But early basketball, as weird as this sounds, they didn't think tall people could play basketball. They thought they didn't have the coordination. They thought they'd be too awkward and slow. And this is stuff that George Miken heard growing up. He heard, as weird as this sounds, he was too tall to play basketball. And if you look at, and this is always what pisses me off, people talk about the 1960s Wilt Chamberlain era like it's this era that I'm specifically talking about right now, where centers were 6'3". Sometimes people grossly strawman the 1960s era. They say Wilt played 6'3" midgets. No. I'm talking a real era where centers were actually that tall. So if you go back until the 1920s, right? 1930s, there were a bunch of basketball leagues around the country. So it's kind of really hard to pick, what league you can kind of study. I mean, there was a bunch, and I've tried to do my research in covering all the different basketball leagues around the country in the early days. But one of the really good early centers was a guy by the name of Moose Krauss. Well, Moose was his nickname. His actual name was Edward. And he was an athletic beast of his day. He played football, he played basketball, he played baseball, he played track. He also coached at Notre Dame, where he was a 3-time consensus All-American in basketball in 1932 to 1934. Now, he was considered probably the greatest center of the early days. But you know what? He was 6'3". And that's okay for that era. And like I said, there wasn't really any big basketball leagues during that time. The ABL was pretty new. Back then, if you wanted to make it as a professional basketball player, you weren't going to make a good living in it, but you could find a league that you could play in around the country. And fans, it's really hard to explain, but fans weren't watching all over the country. I mean, there was no social media. I know television started coming, but come on, let's be realistic. They weren't showing basketball games. The only way you could really figure out about a basketball player is by going to a basketball game. And Moose Krauss, he played for the original Celtics. A lot of people don't realize this. There was an original team called the Celtics. I know that sounds weird, but nothing to do with the Celtics of the 60s and 50s, whatever. But anyways, that was to give you an example of an early center. Basketball was much shorter back then. You know, like if you look at some of those Harlem Globetrotter teams of the 30s and 40s, they didn't have guys that were 7 foot tall. You know, I think Goose Tatum. So if somebody wants to correct me if I'm wrong, I think Goose Tatum, who was one of the best basketball players of his generation, was 6'3". I've heard conflicting reports of how tall he was, but nonetheless, Moose Krauss was considered the best center of his era. Yeah. But you know, he wasn't very tall. And the center position back then, it's very unrecognizable even to the 50s and 60s. What I mean by this is, I don't want to call it positionless basketball, but the center would be about the same size as the point guard, you know? And there wasn't a lot of emphasis on fast breaks. What I mean by this is this fast breaks became very popular with the Bill Russell and the Celtics, where, you know, Russell would get the rebound and throw it quick to the guard. It was a very, very slow game in the 30s, 20s, and early 40s. You know, games would be like 27-33. But, you know, somebody had the genius idea that, hey, if we draft someone who's tall, he might be able to dominate. So there's two big men that I really credit starting the big man movement. And for me, it's George Miken and Bob Kirkland. Now, Miken, like I mentioned, he was kind of awkward, but it was his college coach that convinced him that, hey, you're closer to the hoop, man. You can dominate over these little guys. And he would help Miken by giving him dance lessons. The reason why he did this is he wanted to teach Miken coordination, how to be good on his feet, because a lot of tall people are clumsy, you know. He wanted to get Miken some speed behind him, you know, and he didn't just teach him like foot speed. He also got him on the handbags, you know, like boxing training to get him good hands. And he had a very good collegiate career at DePaul University. And he would go to the NBL, which, like I said, was the league before the NBA. They merged. And his team that he was on, so he was originally on the Chicago Gears, right? And he won a championship there. And then he went to the Lakers, right? Back then they were called the Minneapolis Lakers. Now, the Gears, they actually folded. So there was a dispersal draft with those players. And there were 11 remaining NBL franchises. As a consequence, every team had a 9% chance of landing Miken. And lo and behold, it was the Minneapolis Lakers. So he won a championship with the Lakers in the NBL. Then, in April of 1948, he led the Lakers to a victory in the World Professional Basketball Tournament, where he was named the MVP after a scoring tournament record, 40 points. And the following year, the Lakers and 3 other NBL franchises went to the BAA, which would later become the NBA. I know this is confusing, but I'm getting somewhere with this. So he won 2 championships in the NBL, right? and he would eventually win 5 championships in the NBA. So he's a 7-time champion. He's a MVP of the NBL. They didn't have MVP awards when he played in the NBA. That didn't come until 1957. He's a two-time first team for the NBL, 6-time All-NBA first team. He's the NBL scoring champion. He's a 3-time NBA scoring champion. And he's a 3-time consensus first-team All-American at DePaul University. And he's a WPBT champion in 1948. You know, the accolades go on and on and on. But he, to me, is what started the movement. I know I mentioned Bob Kirkland. But Bob Kirkland, he was more of a great collegiate player. He won 3 AAU championships from 47 to 50. He's a 6-time AAU All-American, 2-time NCAA champion, and he's a 3-time consensus first-team All-American. But he never really had a professional career. Although he would play with the Phillips 66ers, which I know nobody's going to know what that is. It was a ABL team. He never went over to the NBA. You know, he didn't have the same level of success as Miken. But one thing you got to understand is college basketball was a lot more popular than professional basketball. So I think the mistake people can make is looking when they assess Bob Kirkland and George Miken. A mistake that they can make is saying, well, Kirkland didn't do anything. He didn't become a successful NBA player like Miken. But, you know, college basketball had really good turnouts back then. I'm sure he was very well known back then. And he was a 7-footer himself. So these two, to me, started this trend of big men, right? And the thing about Miken, he implemented a lot of rule changes. For example, he was so dominant that the NBA had to change many rules, such as, which has been called the Miken rule, which is when they widen the lane from 6 feet to 12 feet, because he was just so big. He could camp down there. He also played a role in the introduction of the shot clock. And in the NCAA, his dominating play around the basket led to outlawing defensive goaltending, because he would just jump up and swat the ball as it's going in. And I think Miken kind of, you know, on paper, if you look at his numbers, you might say, well, he started struggling when they implemented the shot clock. But he was dealing with so many injuries, you know. In his career, Miken had suffered 10 broken bones, 16 stitches, and he played through these injuries, man. And despite only being 29 years old in the 53-54 NBA season, he declined to 18 points and 14 rebounds because he was just on his last legs. And he tried definitely to play it out. His final, well, I shouldn't say final. He had a last hurrah in 1954, and he retired because of injury. And he would try to come back in 55-56, and he'd only play 37 games before retiring. And he was only 31. Just injuries took this man apart, similar to Bill Walton. But you know who looked up to George Miken as a kid? Bill Russell. Now, Bill Russell says his 2 childhood heroes were his father and George Miken. And he actually met George Miken in high school. And Bill Russell revolutionized the game even more. Because although Miken kind of taught people that, hey, you can be big and dominate, Russell and the Boston Celtics, I'm not giving Russell the sole credit, because a lot of it was Arbeck, came up with, I shouldn't say came up with, I'm sure somebody else thought of it, but they mastered the fast break, you know. And Russell took defense to a whole new level. Shot blocking, post defense. He's the all-time leader in defensive win shares. And let's go back a little bit before his NBA career. He had a great collegiate career himself. He led the University of San Francisco to 2 consecutive NCAA championships before joining the Boston Celtics, and he would have an Olympic gold medal. So he's the winningest player of all time. He won 11 championships in 13 years and 5 MVPs. Like I said, he revolutionized defense with shot blocking and physical man-to-man defense. And he became the blueprint of what a center is supposed to be defensively. And like I said, I don't mean to sound like a broken record here. His strategy was grab the defensive rebound, and I don't think people really understand how good of a rebounder he was. I consider him up there with Dennis Rodman. Maybe even better. And he would initiate the fast break, throwing it outlet pass to the point guard Bob Cousy. And he was also, looking past just how he changed the game from a playing standpoint, he also changed the game socially because he's the first African-American superstar. Yes, there were African-American players before him, but he's the first to be the best in the league, hands down, right? And he's the first African-American coach. So, going into the late 50s, he won 57. He lost in 58 because of an injury. He won in 59. It looks like the league is his, right? Well, here comes Wilt Chamberlain, a 7'1", 275-pound monster. Now, Chamberlain played college ball for the Kansas Jayhawks, leading them to the 1957 title against the North Carolina Tar Heels. Although the Jayhawks lost by 1 point in the triple overtime, Chamberlain was named the tournament's most outstanding player. Briefly a member of the Harlem Globetrotters before joining the Philadelphia Warriors in the NBA in 1959. Now, Chamberlain took it a step further because one of his nicknames is the Record Book. He holds the most records. I don't even know how many he owns. Last I checked, it was like 60-something records he holds, And he's just so dominant. His rookie season, he averaged 37 points per game, won MVP in his rookie year. He scored 100 points in one game, averaging 50 points per game. And so through the 60s, you couldn't win a championship unless you had a big man. Because all through the 60s, it was the Celtics or Wilt Chamberlain, because he won a championship in 1967 with the Philadelphia 76ers. And yes, he'd win a second one with the Los Angeles Lakers in 72, but right now I'm talking about the 60s. You needed to have a big man, so teams started drafting a lot of big men. Willis Reed comes to mind. Nate Thurmond. Zelmo Beatty. Walt Bellamy, to name a few. And sure, there were a lot of other centers that were 6'10" to 7 foot that weren't Hall of Fame level, like Wilt or Russell, that were good role players during this era. But I'm only mentioning the biggest ones of that era. And they all tried to play similar. And what I mean by this is the center would be the focal point of the defense, right? Throwing outlet passes. They all tried to replicate what Bill Russell did. Even Wilt Chamberlain did. Greatest offensive player probably ever. Later changed his game style to play more like Russell so he could win. But, there's only one point guard in the 1960s, or only one guard that won MVP in the 60s, and that was Oscar Robertson. That shows you how dominant the center position was. And, I mentioned Nate Thurmond. he was one of the greatest defensive players of that generation. Doesn't get talked about enough. So, in these days, you had to have a dominant center to win a championship. You're not going to win if you don't have a dominant center. There's no three-point line. Your focal point isn't the guards yet. Thurman was best known as a screen setter in the league, and he averaged 21 points. He averaged 21.3 and 22.0 rebounds per game in the 66, 67, and 67, 68 season, and that's exceeded only by Chamberlain and Russell. That's how good of a rebounder he was. Now, as the 60s would go on, like I said, there'd be new centers looking to take the spotlight. One was Willis Reed. He won an MVP in 1970. He won 2 championships in the early 70s. But the Celtics dynasty of the 60s wasn't like what would play out in the 70s. The 70s had a lot more parity. There was never a team that won back-to-back. And to show you what was happening next in the late 60s, the UCLA Bruins under coach John Wooden built the greatest dynasty in NCAA basketball history. They won 7 consecutive titles between 1967 and 1973. UCLA had already won 2 consecutive titles in 64 and 65. But Wooden started changing their play style, building around Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He led the UCLA to 3 championships in 67, 68, and 69, winning the first Naismith College Player of the Year award. During his college career, the NCAA enacted a ban on dunking to try to limit his dominance. But he would enter the league the following season after Bill Russell's retirement. So now there's a new torchbearer to the center position. And boy, did he run with it. He won a championship just his sophomore season. That's how good he was. And he would win in the 70s 5 MVPs. His last MVP, his 6th one, would be in 1980. He owned the 70s the way Jordan owned the 90s, or LeBron owned the 2010s. Although he didn't have the strength that Chamberlain had, he had a much longer wingspan, and he was more durable because he was very strict about his physical fitness, and this allowed his body to last over 20 years. Think about this. He played from 1969 to 1989. He got to play a lot of people, Now, another product of John Wooden's UCLA program was Bill Walton. Yes, I know he gets a lot of hate nowadays. People are even saying he doesn't belong on the NBA 75 list, but he might be the greatest collegiate player of all time, him or Kareem. He led the UCLA back-to-back titles in 1972 and 1973. And he also led the Portland Trailblazers to an NBA championship in 1977. And he won the MVP the following year. And we all know he was plagued with injuries. And he had a broken bone in his left foot. And it seemed like every year he was hurt. I've covered him before. I won't get into how many injuries this guy had. Just look it up for yourself. I could make a whole video talking about his injuries, It's sad. And I heard today, I was reading, before I wanted to make this video, I was reading about him. He had 37 operations in his playing career. He had like glass bones. And he would win another championship with the Boston Celtics in 1986, which would be his healthiest season. And so, like I said, 70s would be other players coming to the torch, Willis Reed, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Walton, and Dave Cowens is another great defensive center. Then you had guys like Wes Unseld, Artis Gilmore, Moses Malone, Robert Parrish. So, as the 70s would go on, the strategy would be in the 80s, I don't mean to sound cliche here, was draft the tallest player that you can. There's a lot of tall players that didn't really pan out in the 80s. Guys like Manute Bol, Mark Eaton. Mark Eaton was a great player, don't get me wrong, but he wasn't a Hakeem Olajuwon. He wasn't a Shaq. You know what I mean? There was a lot of just tall players just drafted for the reason of being tall. To give you a idea of the culture of drafting centers, in the 1984 draft, as weird as this sounds, the logical choice, right, in the 1984 draft would be to draft Michael Jordan, right? But, who got drafted first? Well, Hakeem Olajuwon, obviously, because he's a center. But what I mean to get at is, who was drafted before Michael Jordan? Sam Bowie. It's kind of crazy looking back, saying, why would you draft Sam Bowie before Michael Jordan? You can't even use the argument that Sam Bowie was a better college player. No, the reason why is because the idea back then was you build your team around a center. You draft the tallest player you can. That's why the Rockets took Hakeem. That's why the Trailblazers took Sam Bowie. But the Bulls are right to pick Michael Jordan. So, when Jordan came, this kind of, especially when he won his first title in 91, this kind of showed teams that you can build a championship contender without having a Hall of Fame level center, because those Bulls teams, they never really had a great center. I mean, Luke Longley. So, especially with the three-point line, it started giving guards more of an opportunity to be, I want to say, a focal point. And, getting back to my original point, the league average height in the 80s was the tallest it's ever been because of them drafting so many tall players. And, like I mentioned with the three-point shot being introduced in the 79-80 season, although the stretch five wasn't really a thing league-wide yet, there were centers like Bill Laimbeer and Jack Sigma who had a pretty reliable outside shot. But John Thompson, for anyone who doesn't know who that is, he was the coach over at the Georgetown Hoyas. And he was actually a backup to Bill Russell back in the day on the Celtics. And he coached three amazing big men at Georgetown, which would later be in the NBA. Patrick Ewing, Dikembe Mutombo, and Alonzo Mourning. And to me, this is the new wave of centers. I think it started with Hakeem Olajuwon. And the centers of the 90s, I consider is the next generation. You had Patrick Ewing, David Robinson, Hakeem Olajuwon, like I mentioned. Ralph Sampson didn't really pan out because of injuries, but he was on his way. I mentioned Dikembe Mutombo. Shaquille O'Neal was another big one in the 90s. So I consider the 90s, I know I might sound like a hypocrite here, but let me explain. I know the 90s belonged to Jordan, and it showed that guards can lead a team to a championship. But I consider the 90s to be the last time the last decade that centers were running it. By a position. Because outside of Jordan, you can't really say the shooting guard position was that deep. I'm sorry, it's just they weren't as deep. And, in the 90s, you had Hakeem Olajuwon win 2 championships. You had Shaq lead his team to the finals. Before he would win, well, I'll get into that later. Robertson won a championship on the Spurs in 1999. And Shaquille O'Neal was kind of, to me, the last of that, I don't want to say generation, but last of that great generation, because a lot of the centers started to age in the 1990s, and there became more international centers like Vlade Divac, Arvydas Sabonis, and they were more playmaking perimeter shooting bigs and had a European style play. So I consider Shaq to be that last great one. Because Robinson got old by the late 90s. Hakeem got old by the late 90s. Alonzo Mourning was dealing with injuries. Shaq led it into the 2000s. He won 3 championships in the 2000s. Yeah, there were other great centers in the 2000s. You had actually some great defensive centers like Ben Wallace, who won a championship in 2004. But he didn't last as long as Shaq. I should take that back. Yes, he played longer in the league than Shaq. He retired after him, but he wasn't an all-star level player towards the end. Shaq was still competing up until, I'd say, around 2008, 2009. He won a championship in 2006. And unfortunately, in my opinion, maybe some people will disagree with this, this is when the traditional center, where you go down low, block shots, play post defense, started dying off. One of the last great ones, it sounds really sad, but one of the last great centers of the early 2010s, late 2000s, was Dwight Howard. He won those Defensive Player of the Years. And yeah, there was Marc Gasol, there was Tyson Chandler, but I don't really consider them to the level of the centers of the past. I mean, are you really going to put Marc Gasol in the conversation of a Shaquille O'Neal or a Hakeem Olajuwon or a Tyson Chandler in that? It was just a very weak time for centers. Dwight Howard was the best center in the league in the early 2010s. But then as the NBA started going more small ball, the center possession really took a strong hit. To give you an example, the Warriors won 3 championships, 2015, 2017, 2018. They were in a real small, quick lineup called the Death lineup, where they were playing the 6'7" Draymond Green at center. And this would create matchup problems for larger centers, and he had enough defensive versatility and speed and ball handling skills and perimeter shooting. So this kind of changed the landscape where if you're a center, you had to play like a guard. And Dwight Howard really suffered. He was still putting up good numbers. I don't think people realize Dwight Howard didn't just fall off a cliff. As recently as like 2018, he was a 12 rebound per game guy. It's just his play style was kind of out of date. Demarcus Cousins might be the best center, I'd say, between 2012 to 2017. I don't know if you figure out when he was the best in the league, but he was a stretch big. And we started seeing the emergence of stretch centers, stretch fives, whatever the word is. And now we're seeing a renaissance of centers. We got Nikola Jokic, who's won 2 MVPs in a row, the past 2 MVPs. You have Joel Embiid, great defensive big, but at the same time, he has post moves. But at the same time, he can take it out and shoot it. And what makes Nikola so good is he's one of probably the greatest passing big we've ever seen. He plays like a guard. He's got such good court vision. So this is where the center position's at today. And I don't, for example, the Miami Heat at one point consider themselves positionless basketball by Eric Spoelstra, with power forwards Chris Bosh and Udonis Haslem shifting between the center and power forward. I didn't like that. But that's just the way the league is going. With the Warriors small ball, the Heat kind of started it a little bit at center. So centers today are kind of figuring out how to play like guards. I don't like it as much. Maybe this is just my personal preference. The game is always going to evolve. In 70 years, we'll be talking about how it evolves from now. Somebody 70 years from now will be looking back at basketball in 2022 and say, I miss those good old days. But I think the league is in good hands, too, in Nikola Jokic, Joel Embiid. I would love to see a finals matchup between these two. It'd be like a classic Patrick Ewing versus Hakeem Olajuwon matchup. Or Wilt versus Russell. Or Shaq versus Robinson. I'd like to see a rivalry come out of this. Other goods, I wish I could say that there's a lot of other great MVP caliber centers right now. You got guys like Rudy Gobert, who's a great defensive player. You have other centers that I give respect to, like Yusuf Nurkic. He plays pretty good defense. But this is the way the league is going. So let me know what your guys' thoughts are down below. Do you like this positionless basketball, or do you prefer seeing centers play down low? And to me, it's all personal preference. I don't hate anybody who thinks differently on a topic this minuscule, but I do really like Nikola Jokic and Joel Embiid, and I think I'm going to appreciate them. Yeah, it's a different game, but it's still good. So what do you guys think about the center position, how it's evolved? And who's your favorite center of all time? What's the best era, in your opinion, of centers? If you could go back and watch any center in their prime, who would it be? Let me know your thoughts down below. Thanks for watching.